Hey everyone, it's Mace1370. Today I'm going to go over my updated gear guide for 2021. Before we get into it though, please make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Also, please see the video description below for a link to my Discord. Okay, so people play Epic 7 for, all sorts of reasons. Some people enjoy PvE content like the main story or side stories. Other people like PvE challenges like the Abyss. PvP is a huge reason to play this game. I'm really into real-time arena. Regardless of what aspects of the game you enjoy, if you want to progress and to do well, you need to build heroes, and the core of that is gear. You can 6-star a hero and fully awaken it and even fully mullet it, but if you don't have good gear on that hero, it's not going to perform very well. So that's why I want to talk about gear today. We're going to go over all the different sets that are in the game, kind of what your priorities should be in terms of farming the different hunts as you move through different stages of progression. I'm also going to go over how to evaluate a piece of gear, how you should know if you should roll that piece of gear or not, and when to stop rolling it, and then goals to set for yourself as you move through, the early game, the middle game, and the end game. So let's go ahead and kick it off by talking about the different sets of gear found in the various hunts. Okay, so for the purposes of this guide, I'm going to assume that you've cleared the early story. So you've finished, chapter 1010 of episode 1, and you're ready to jump into a hunt and start farming some gear for your heroes. You have a bunch of hunts to choose from, and I'll go more into depth in each one of these later on, but just briefly for this, I think the Wyvern hunt is the best bang for your buck when you first start. And the reason for that is pretty simple. The sets available here are all useful for a new player. Additionally, Speed Set is the most universally useful set in the entire game. The vast majority of my heroes are built on Speed Set, so gear that you can get while you're farming this in the beginning is going to be useful for pretty much the entire duration of your account. Crit Set is more useful in the beginning of the game than later. That said, even as a very late game player, I do use many Crit Set pieces, so much of the gear you get will still be useful later on. Hit Set is useful in the beginning and arguably drops off later on in the game. There's just a lot of other priorities that you want to have, whether that be penetration set or immunity for units, so it's hard to fit hit set in. That said, you can still use these pieces on PvE heroes, or heroes that you don't use in RTA and don't need, like the perfect set combinations and stuff. So because all three of these sets are useful, you're going to get a lot more gear in the beginning farming Wyvern 13, and because Speed Set is so useful later on in the game, you're getting gear that's useful now and useful later. So that's why I think Wyvern is the best hunt to start with. I'm going to briefly talk about these other hunts now and like how you might use those sets in the future. Golem is a hunt I think you should essentially avoid. There are very niche scenarios where you're going to want to use any of these sets. The health set and the defense set are both two-piece sets, so they would fit in somewhere like where a penetration set would or where an immunity set would. You hypothetically could use them for a unit like SSB, where you could put like 2 health sets and then an immunity set or something like that on her. But if you're farming Golem, you're not getting Speed Set, so it's really detrimental, I think, for an early game player. Maybe late game if you want to build, a unit like on some sort of meme, like a resistance ML-Ken or something, you could farm one of these. But generally speaking, there's just more useful sets elsewhere. So I would avoid Golem for that reason. It's not that these sets are unusable or bad, it's just that you're really giving up too much value from the other hunts to make this worth farming. In the past, actually, these sets were just strictly worse because the amount of stat bonus you got from the defense and the health set was just way lower than the stuff you got from like Crit Set, for example. So even if these sets would be appropriate to use on a hero, you were like losing stats to do that, and it made it even worse. They did change Golem, so it's better now, but you're still giving up the ability to farm other more useful sets, and so I don't recommend farming Golem pretty much at all. Banshee is a pretty popular hunt, but I think Banshee is a bit of a trap. It has 4 sets, and Counter and Lifesteal set are both very useful. There's many in-game heroes for PvP that really benefit from having one of these. For an early game player, though, I don't think you really benefit much from them at all. Destruction set is pretty difficult to use. I don't really have a single unit that uses Destruction set, although the stat bonus is decent, so you probably could build something on it. Resist set is pretty useful, and I do have a fair number of heroes on Resist set. However, this hunt is really, I think, more appropriate for a later game player. In the beginning, you're going to get way more value by farming Wyvern because way more heroes can use the Wyvern gear. Banshee gear is really good for certain specific heroes, but those are kind of like late game PvP things. And so we'll talk a bit about how to prioritize that after we talk about the other hunts. Azumanic Hunt has the immunity set, and this set is extremely valuable for PvP. For early game players, not necessary at all. However, once you get into RTA, you're going to want to have a good number of units on immunity, and so you'll need immunity at that point. Unity set is a complete meme. You don't need it at all. Rage set is really nice for later game players who want to optimize a really fast hunt or accomplish some of the more difficult PvP content. You can really benefit from Rage because it'll do a lot of damage, you know, it debuffs on the boss. Not useful for PvP, but is nice for certain PvP team or PvE teams, I should say. So Azumanic Hunt is a hunt I generally recommend people farm after they've been in Wyvern for a little while and they want to put immunity on a few, heroes. So Katie's is our newest hunt, and when this first released, no one really touched it because the sets were not good, and then they buffed them, and so now they're pretty good. Penetration set gives you a lot of value. I think you get more value damage-wise out of penetration set than you do from like a crit set, for example. So if you're going to run a unit without immunity, and it's going to be a damage dealing unit, penetration set is almost certainly going to be your go-to. It only works on single target attacks, so you have to take that into consideration as well. Injury set is very niche. There are only one or two heroes that you really would want to build on injury set. An example would be Bellion, perhaps Seaside Bologna, and if you wanted to really meme, I guess like Holiday Euphine or something, but really the only ones I ever see on injury are either Seaside Bologna or Bellion. And Seaside Bologna is not really in the meta right now. And farming, Katie's just to build an injury Bellion is something only a late game player should be doing. Lastly, Revenge set is not really usable right now. The only hero I could think to use Revenge set would maybe be Blue Crowl, and that would maybe be just a side bonus of being in Katie's to get penetration set. And I wouldn't even say a Revenge Crow is any better than a speed set Crow. It's just like he could use that gear, I guess. So now that we've kind of gone over the general priorities for hunts, let's talk a little bit about why farming something like Banshee early game is, I think, a mistake. So ultimately, when you're farming hunts, you're doing this for gear, and that gear is going to go on to heroes. So I get a lot of questions, when should I be farming, X hunt, or I've been farming Wyvern for a while, how do I know if I should jump into Banshee? And the answer is you have to figure out what units you're currently building. So if you have a few units in mind that you want to use for PvP, or that you've identified are the meta units, look at how those heroes are built, and chances are it's probably going to be speed set, but it could be something else. If it's speed set, you obviously need to do Wyvern until you get that gear. If you want to build a hero that uses like Lifesteal set, for example, then you're going to have to jump into Banshee. And at that point, I think you need to stay in Banshee until you get the hero built. Because if you stay in Banshee and you only get 3 pieces of gear for that hero and you can't build them on Lifesteal, you just wasted that time and you got no value, right? You have gotten no return at that point. So I can give you some examples here. So all these heroes are on speed set. Speed set, speed set, speed set, speed set, speed set. Just a tremendous number of heroes on speed set. But there are some heroes that are not, that are on like Lifesteal, for example. So Remnant Violet I have on Lifesteal. He's also on penetration set. Determining when you need to build Remnant Violet is going to be a factor of what the current meta is, and obviously that's going to shift. So if you want to build a hero on one of these off non-Wyvern sets, identify how much of a priority they are for you. Now, if this is a hero that is the core of your draft and you're picking them every single time, then it probably is appropriate to jump into Banshee at that point, and really get going, to farm out their gear. And a nice example of that might be like Green Violet became super meta relevant, towards the late end of last season. He kind of dropped off right at the very end, thank goodness, but prior to that, it was looking like he was going to be a pretty dominant force. And even though he kind of dropped off a bit at the end, he was still very prevalent. Not having Violet on a Lifesteal set kind of makes him unusable. So it would be very reasonable to jump into Banshee for that reason at the end of last season, to get him geared up and ready to go. So you really have to identify like what heroes you're building, and identify that while you're in Banshee, getting that Banshee gear, you're not getting gear for your speed heroes. So the other time it's appropriate to jump into Banshee, if you don't necessarily have a specific unit in mind, is if you've been farming Wyvern for so long, you have a glut of speed gear. And you'll know you have that because you'll look at, your fribbles, or you'll be gearing, and you'll see that you've easily geared your entire roster and you have a ton of spare speed set pieces. You have no problems, getting a new hero leveled up, throwing, high gear score speed gear on them. You don't have to steal from a bunch of units. But if you notice every time a new unit comes out and you want to build them on speed set and you're having to steal pieces from people, you probably need to farm Wyvern a bit more. So this is ultimately something that you're going to have to look at your own account and assess and, apply some critical thinking and figure out, where am I in the game? What are my priorities? And to do that, you just have to look at the meta and see what heroes you're building. So kind of a it depends answer, but that's the best I can do. Okay, so now that I've done a brief overview of the different hunts, that you can farm, you finish story, you're about to jump into Wyvern. How do you know what gear is good gear? So to figure that out, we're going to have to quickly explain how left gear is different than right gear, what the substat combinations are, how to calculate gear score, etc. So all gear has substats down here in a main stat. Left-sided gear always has the exact same main stat, so weapons always have attack, helms always have health, chests always have defense, and these are always flat numbers on left-sided gear, so flat defense, flat health, flat attack. Right-sided gear has variable main stats. So for example, this neck has crit damage percentage, but necks can have other main stats, like this one right here is attack percentage. So every time you get a neck, it's going to be randomized what the main stat is. The same thing goes for the rings and for boots. There are some main stats that can only be found on boots, and that's speed. Only boots can have the speed main stat. For rings, only rings can have effectiveness or effect resistance. And for necks, only necks can have crit damage or critical hit chance percentage. All three of these could have attack percentage, defense percentage, and health percentage. They can also have the flat versions of those, so flat attack, flat defense, flat health. So ideally, you're going to look for speed on the boots, and then some percentage thing on your neck and ring. However, what exactly you're looking for is going to vary based on the type of unit you're building. So let's take a moment to talk about substat combinations. To figure out what substat combinations you want to have, you need to figure out what the role of that unit is. So there's several different roles. Kisei is a damage dealer. Damage dealers obviously want to do damage, and we don't really care about how tanky they are. We want them to go fast, so they take a bunch of turns, and then we want them to have high attack, crit chance, and crit damage, so when they do take a turn, they do a bunch of damage. It's pretty straightforward. So if we look at the gear here, you're going to see those combination of substats. You're going to see speed, attack, crit damage, crit chance, and pretty much the same thing for all of these pieces. I will use this opportunity to point out that you cannot get attack percentage or flat attack on chest pieces. The head pieces can have any combination of substats. However, because they have flat health up here, you will not find flat health down here. It's impossible. Likewise, you cannot find flat defense down here on the chest. It has to be up there. And for weapons, you cannot get flat defense or defense percentage. So the potential number of substats are limited on the left side, and most limited on the weapon and the chest. Helms have more substat combinations than either of those. On the right side, because they have a variable main stat, they have even more combinations of potential substats than on the left side. That's why it's harder to get good right-sided gear than good left-sided gear. For damage dealing heroes, they're going to want crit damage or crit chance up here, and then offensive stuff down here. Same idea, you have attack percentage up here, and so now we have our crit chance, crit damage, and speed, and we have to have one more thing in the fourth, and since we can't get another percentage, we just go with flat attack. For boots, the best value is speed main stat, and then you want your percentages down here. Theoretically, for an ideal damage dealer boot, I would swap this over to flat attack for Kisei, but I had these boots on a bruiser before, so I'll just leave it as defense percent for now. A quick note on how to tell whether a flat stat or a percentage is better. Flat stats just add that raw amount to the score, or to the stat here. So if you put this helmet on, it's going to add 2,835 health to whatever Kisei's health is. So if her health is 10,000 without the helm and you put the helm on, it's going to be 10,000 plus 2,835. The percentages are going to be different for every single hero, and it's going to add 18% of whatever her base attack or base defense or base health is. To figure out what the base stats are, you can either subtract out everything they have or take all their gear off, or probably a lot easier, you can go to the journal right here and look up a hero. You can go to preview stats, make sure they're 6-star and awakened, right? Because now they're fully built, and you can see these are the base stats here. So if I was to put an item with a substat of 10% HP onto Kisei, it would add 570.4 health to whatever her total was. So units with higher base stats will get a bigger benefit of percentages. Generally speaking, percentages are better than flat for almost every hero. There are a few niche exceptions to that. For example, Tamarin has extremely low base health, and so flat health is essentially just as good for her, if not slightly better. Green Violet has incredibly bad base defense, so flat defense is pretty good for him. But in general, percentages are better, so you're looking for percentages. So now that we know we need percentages, we have to figure out what combination of substats is good. I've gone over the damage dealers. We talked about wanting to do get attack, speed, crit damage, crit chance, but damage dealers are not the only type of hero in this game. There are actually many different types of heroes. Ambitious Tywin is a tank, so you want him to have health and defense. You also want him to take turns, so he needs speed. And because he debuffs, he puts decreased speed and stun, you need to build effectiveness on him. Effectiveness makes it easier for him to land debuffs. Effect resistance makes it harder for people to land debuffs on that unit. So because he's a debuffer, I don't really care about effect resistance. So if we look at the combination of substats here, you can see that this combination of health percentage, defense percentage, effectiveness percentage, and speed, this is a very common combination that you look for when you're building tanky debuffers like Tywin that don't need to do damage. There are some debuffers that do damage. An example would be Summertime Iseria, and all of her damage based on her kit comes from her attack for the most part, because they're all bombs, and bomb damage is based off attack. So for her, we care about HP, defense, attack, speed, and effectiveness. So if we look at her substats here, this would be a good combination of substats for a unit like Iseria, or Summertime Iseria. We can't get defense percentage on here because it is a sword, right? So this is the ideal combination. You could have like flat health here and it would still be okay, but not as good, right? Because in general, percentages are better than flat stats. So debuffers, that's one class of unit. Another type of unit is going to be a bruiser. Apocalypse Ravi is probably one of the prototypical bruisers in the meta right now. Bruisers, part of their survivability is just by built in with health and defense, so they want both of those. They also need to do damage, so you want attack, crit chance, and crit damage. And you want them to take turns, so you need speed. Bruisers typically don't debuff, and even if they do, you oftentimes don't really build them with effectiveness, because you don't have the room. You only get so many rolls on your gear, and you really need to spread them out through all these different things, and so it's very difficult to do that and get effectiveness as well. Same goes for effect resistance. So if we look at the gear here, she's going to have a larger combination of substats compared to like a damage dealer, right? Because damage dealers don't really care about health and defense. So you can get almost any combination of percentages here, and it's going to be good for her, right? You just want really high rolls. And this is what makes speed gear so versatile. You're getting all these different combinations of substats that are good on different heroes. An exception, or an example of where that wouldn't be the case, would be Lifesteal Gear. So Lifesteal Gear, you want the bruiser stuff. So a bruiser spread, like this piece, has health, percentage, attack percentage, speed, and crit damage. But there really is no there really is no debuffer like Tywin that uses Lifesteal. So if you got a Lifesteal piece with the substat combinations that Tywin had, it wouldn't be useful. And this is why it's so valuable to farm Wyvern in the beginning of the game, because Wyvern has more useful combinations of substats, which means it's easier to get gear, which means that your account will progress more quickly when you farm Wyvern in the beginning. Okay, so here is Crowl. He is another type of unit. He's a tank like Tywin, but Crowl, we kind of care more about him being able to put up defense buff and use his horse ability, so we don't want him to get controlled. So we built him with effect resistance. He does have a debuff on his S1 with provoke, but most people don't really care about that. The value is less than him getting his S3 off, right? So we built him with effect resistance to make it harder for him to get debuffed, and then other than that, his stats are going to look similar to Tywin because we don't care about damage. So if you look at, this spread here, this is a pretty common combination of substats you're going to look for when you build tanks like Crow or Soul Weavers. They want health, ER percentage, speed, and on weapons, we can't get defense even though we'd want it, so we have to put flat health here because there's nothing else that can go here that would benefit him. He doesn't really want attack percentage, he doesn't want crit or crit damage or anything like that, so flat health is best. If we look at a helm like this, health, defense, speed, ER, these are all the 4 that he wants, so this is a perfect helm for him. Same thing with the chest piece here, so you get the idea. On the left side, on the right side, you generally look for health on the main stat here. The ring could be ER, it could be health, it could be defense. It doesn't really matter as long as you get the stats that you're looking for. And then speed is usually best for the boot. So that covers most of the variety of substats that you're going to get. You can see that Soul Weavers here are looking for the same stat priority as Crow, where they want tank, they want speed, and they want ER. There are some niche units that have kind of weird builds and stuff like that, but this is kind of a general overview, so we'll skip those for now. Okay, so now that I've gone over the various combination of substats that you're going to look for, we should talk about how to determine if you need to roll a piece of gear and when you should stop. So you'll notice all these pieces have a plus 15. That means they're fully leveled up, so they're done being enhanced. As you enhance them from 0 to 15, they gain additional stats. So let's take a look at some items here. So this is a purple piece. Purple pieces start with 3 substats. Red pieces start with 4, and blue pieces start with 2. So when you're brand new to the game, you'll probably be rolling some purples. When you get later on, you'll stop. And then you'll really just be focusing on red pieces of gear because they start with 4 substats. And we go to enhance here, and you can use charms or you can use other fodder pieces of gear to level them up. And you get you get more stats every 3 levels. And we call those rolls. So every 3 levels you get a roll on the item. So 3, 6, 9, 12, and 15. 5 rolls. So that's why the red items are better. They essentially start with an extra roll. Because purple items here, they start with 3, and then on their plus 12 roll, they open up their 4th stat. Whereas red pieces just add more stats to one of the 4 they already have. So red pieces effectively get 1 more roll of stats than purples do. So I'll give you an example here. We'll roll this gear and see what happens. Okay, so it went into effect resistance. So each time you level up a piece of gear, it's going to be random as to what available substat it hits, and then once it hits one of them, it will increase that by a random amount. That random amount is dependent on what it rolls into. So speed can roll between 1 and 5 in general. There's some, I think red pieces can't roll 1s. Smilegate posted a thing on their website that shows you the exact range that these can roll in, but essentially 1 through 5 for speed, 1 and 5 both being pretty rare, but 5 being the most rare. 5 is incredibly rare. Crit chance can roll between 3 and 5, and effect resistance can roll between 4 and 8, and in fact most percentages roll between 4 and 8. The exceptions to that are crit chance, which as I mentioned 3 to 5, and crit damage, which is 4 to 7. Everything else is 4 to 8. And so each time you increase, so if we go to 6 here, or actually I'll just test, so we'll go to 5 and you'll see nothing happens, and then if we go to 6 we'll get another roll. So it went into effect resistance again, so this could be totally random. So as you're rolling this, you're evaluating, was that roll good enough, right? Because each roll is going to be in a range of stats and you want it to hit your target, and so what should that target be? To determine that, we get to talk about gear score. So gear score is a point-based system that you can use to assign a quality or a score to gear, and then you can determine using that score if it's worth enhancing. So the way that gear score works is for each percentage, you give it 1 point. I should say for each percentage except for crit chance and crit damage, you give it 1 point. For every speed, you give it 2 points. For every crit chance, you give it 1.5 points, and for every crit damage, you give it 1.1 points. The idea here is that you're normalizing everything to a maximum roll of 8. So a max roll for speed is 4, you multiply by that 2 and you get 8, right? So each max roll is, 8 points, so to speak. So again, each percentage is 1 point, crit chance is 1.5, crit damage is 1.1, speed is 2, okay? So you're going to have to use a little bit of arithmetic. Once you know those kind of multiplication factors, you then apply that to determine the starting gear score for a piece. And generally speaking, when you're new to the game, 20 points is about what you're going to look for. And that's 20 points in useful stats, right? So we talked about our potential good substat combinations. This right here, we have attack, crit damage, and health. So this is roughly 18-ish points, plus whatever the flat stat is worth. Flat stats are not useless, but they are worth less than percentages. To determine the exact, point value of flats, you have to look at the base of that unit, right? So whatever the base health of the unit is, you would take 167 divided by the base, and that would give you a number. Generally speaking, people just don't add flats into the gear score, or if they do, they add like 1 or 2 or something. They just kind of eyeball it, right? Because you don't, practically speaking, you're not going to bust out the calculator unless it's a very high value piece and you really want to know exactly like what the gear score is with that flat stat, right? So practically speaking, we could call this about 18, realistically probably more like 19 points because this is 5.5, right, from the crit damage plus a little bit of bonus from the flat health. So probably 19. So this is about where you would need it to be to roll if you were new to the game. You would ideally want a little bit more. So right, health could vary between 4 and 8, so this was kind of a low roll. If it was 6, that would be average, and you'd probably say, okay, we can roll this. If you don't like adding up numbers, you can look at the rolls and say, okay, I have a max roll, I have kind of a less than average roll, and then I have a less than average roll. So overall, this piece did not do super well, right? And I have a flat. Obviously, if it rolls into the flat, that's really bad, right? So we use that base of 20 to start out with because as a new player, your target should be 60 points at the end. You get 5 rolls, and as we've established, the average roll is about 6 points, right? That's in the middle of the 4 to 8 range. So 5 times 6 is 30, and if you start at 20, that gets you to 50, and then when you enhance from 85 to 90, that in general adds about 10 points, and now you're at 60, and that's your target. Why 60 for the target? Well, that's mostly just based on player experience. We've seen that when you have an average of 60 gear score for these 6 slots here, your hero is generally usable in the mid to late game, mid to early late game. I'll give you an example of kind of like gear cutoffs for players. I tend to notice that people with, the average gear score of around 60 for their units, these are people that have just gotten into PvP. So they're probably going to be in Masters or like Champion of RTA. Their units work, but they're kind of lacking stats compared to the higher end players. Once you get into like the 65 average gear score for everything, now you're looking at probably Emperor range. And I'd say once you get to 70 gear score for stuff, that's probably more typical of Legend players. So that's kind of the thresholds that you're going to be looking at when you're determining, should I keep rolling this piece? So as an example, if we know that our target for this piece is 50 at 85 or 60 at 90, we know we need to roll 6 to get there if we started at 20, right? If we want to get to 70, you're going to have to pretty much max roll every single time. So you can kind of see the difference, right? Like what a Legend player is looking for in the quality of a piece. If it starts at 20, they're looking for max rolls. And if you're newer to the game, you can tolerate medium rolls, right? Because you're looking for a lower target. What target you're ultimately looking for is going to be an assessment you have to make based on your gear. And, Fribbles is really helpful for that when you load everything into Fribbles. You can take a look at the gear score for your different heroes, and you can, say to yourself, like, I'm looking at a particular build here, and I noticed that all the pieces are like 60 gear score. So, 65 is like a pretty reasonable target for me to get an upgrade for this unit, and you can shoot for that. So this target is going to slowly move over time. It's going to start out at about 60 post, at level 90 when you reforge it, and then it's going to move up to about 70 when you're at that, like really late game, and then even above 70 for like the super whales that are like really in game is kind of where they're shooting for. So I've talked about how to calculate gear score for an item and how to use that system to determine if a particular item is an upgrade for your account or not. There are a few exceptions to this, and the most common is speed gear. For speed pieces, we don't look at the entire gear score for the item because items are very valuable if they have high speed, kind of regardless of their other substats. Obviously, it's nice to have good substats along with them, but if an item has a super high speed on it, we don't really care so much about the other substats because that item will be useful somewhere. Here's an example. This is a flat main neck, and it happened to have a couple good substats here with the health percentage, and I rerolled it to defense percentage to go along with that, but crit damage doesn't really jive with this, right? That said, it went into speed over and over again, and so this neck became incredible, despite the fact that it's a flat HP neck, right? So the question I get a lot is, when should I roll speed gear? When should I stop rolling it? And the answer to that question is really dependent on how much you spend on the game. If you're free to play, it is very difficult to chase every single item with a speed substat. You just kind of run out of resources pretty quickly if you do that, even with a gold change. So you have to be more picky. If you're a whale, you can likely speed check literally any item with a speed substat if you want to, because you have the resources to roll all of those. After a while, you get to the point where you have enough really fast items that are not on the speed set, and so you kind of become more picky. So I'm at the point where I have a lot of offset items that are not speed set with a high speed roll, and the reality is you can only use so many of those because 4 of your items on a character have to be speed. So if I get another really high speed item that's an offset, it's only useful to me if it rolls really highly, right? Because I have a bunch of like 18 to 20 speed offset pieces that are just going to get outclassed because I don't need as many of them. So over time, like everything else, you become more picky. Most people are looking for the end result of 20 speed on a speed item, and that's pretty easy, or not easy, but it's pretty doable on purple pieces as well as red pieces. So if you're brand new to the game and you're spending money, you can roll literally any purple or red with a speed substat and just go for it. Obviously not boots, right? Because you're looking for speed main on those, so you don't really care about high speed rolls on boots. I'm at the point now where I'm really just looking for speed pieces. I will still roll offsets if they're red and they have a high speed substat down here, because they could still turn into like hypothetically 28 speed pieces or something, right? Because purples get that extra substat down here, the 4th one unlocked at plus 12, you can only roll into speed 4 times. And generally speaking, the max roll for speed is a 4, so that's 16 plus whatever you could start out with, so hypothetically 20, and then when you take it to 90, it could end up as 24 if it was completely perfect. Realistically speaking, when you hit the speed substat, it may not go 4 every single time, it likely won't, so you're probably going to get lower than that. But if you roll 4 times into speed and they're decent rolls, you're probably going to get a 20 plus item, whether it's purple or red. Red items can hypothetically roll 5 times into speed. They still only get plus 4 when they go to 90, but that's obviously very good if it happens. So we can look at an example here. And so for my account, I'm kind of at the point where it has to hit speed every time for it to be an upgrade. So we missed, so this one's done. And were there others? Let's see, I think that was the only sword I had to roll. I did have some others. So here's a helm. The substats on this are garbage, complete garbage, and it's counter set. But it's a red piece with a 4 here, so hypothetically, if this rolls highly into speed every single time, I will be able to use it on one of my speed openers, despite the fact that it's counterset with garbage substats. So we can throw in some stuff here. It did miss. I'm going to go to plus 6. I usually go to plus 6 on red pieces, just because I could still roll 4 times into speed and be, like a 24 speed piece or something when I take it to 90. So let's see here. Roll again. And it missed again, so this one's dead. So this is how you roll speed, is you're, speed checking the item essentially. Here's a piece, pen set. This may not be speed, but pen set I'm still looking for fast pieces. So, and this one also has an offensive substat on it, which is really nice. So if this was to go high speed, that would be super. So we'll take it to +3, and it hit speed. It was only +2, so that's not amazing. So we can hit speed 3 more times here, since purples can only go into speed 4 times. So 3 times 4 is 12, so hypothetically we could get 12 more speed. That would take it to 17, and then we would get an additional 4, taking it to 21. So because this could go to 21, that would be an upgrade for me. I'm going to roll it. And it missed, so now it's dead. So you can kind of see my system there, where if it hits speed, you assess what is the maximum potential speed this piece could go, and if it could, you know, go to a speed that's an upgrade for me, I chase it and I keep going, and then as soon as it misses, I'm done. And I think that's a good system to apply whether you're a free-to-play or a whale. You know, if you're free-to-play and you say, I'm still going to roll some speed pieces, but I'm only looking for speed set, or maybe like the reds that start with 4 if they're an offset, and you know, you're looking for like a 20+ speed piece. Each time it rolls, assess, can it get there? And if it can, you keep going, and if it can't, you stop. So that's how I address speed. Another exception to the gear score rule is that bruisers generally have higher gear score than pure DPS units, and that goes along with their items. You know, with bruisers, you're looking for so many raw stats, right? You want super high gear score on every single piece. DPS heroes, however, I think Kisei is a pretty decent example of that. Because you're looking for a more specific substat combination, right? You want this combination of substats on like literally every single piece to the degree you can get it. You're going to have lower average gear score items for pure DPS gear than you will for bruiser gear. And as a result of that, you should adjust your expectations accordingly, right? Obviously 70+ gear score DPS pieces are great, but you know, 60 is okay too, even if you're late game. You also have to consider for DPS heroes, some of them go super fast, some of them go not as fast, right? So if you're looking for the super fast ones, you can tolerate even lower gear score with the really zoomer pieces. So an example would be like ML Charles, for example. I want DPS stats on him, but he needs to be really fast. And so, you know, we can look at this item. This is 42, plus the 9 attack is 51. So we're at like 60 odd gear score, maybe a teeny bit more, 63 or so. So this isn't even 70 points, but this piece by DPS standards is a banger because it's 21 and has a couple DPS subs on it, even though we missed here on effectiveness, right? But 60, like low 60s gear score is not acceptable for a bruiser for the level of my account. But I adjust my expectations down for really fast DPS gear. And so that's kind of an exception to the gear score rule, or to the, you know, you want 70+ gear score at late game. And you have to apply that to literally all of the types of gear you can get when you're looking at your account. You know, there's a guy in my guild, Rikazo, he has absurd DPS gear. I think his like best DPS gear set on the high speed is I think like 70+ per piece or something. It's totally absurd. Most people aren't there though, and so they adjust their threshold down for that type of gear. Some of the other people in my guild, like they just have bad Soul Weaver gear, right? Maybe their bruiser gear is amazing and really high gear score, so they're looking for 70+ gear score bruiser pieces. But for Soul Weavers, they're tolerating like low 60s because for them that's still an upgrade. So don't say to yourself, okay, I'm late game now. The only good pieces are 70+ gear score, and I have this like 20+ speed sword here, but it's low 60s, so I'm just going to throw it in the trash. You can't do that. You have to look at the type of unit that's going to use that gear and see if it's an upgrade, right? So we use these generalities, but the reality is that it's, you know, it becomes more specific for different types of units. So always take that into account. Okay, so let's just quickly calculate some gear score for a few pieces just so you can get an idea of how I do it. I oftentimes will use a calculator just because it makes it, you know, more quick. So here I'd say 7 times 1.1 for crit damage, plus 9, plus 26 for that, plus 30 for the crit chance. So this is a 72.7 gear score sword. If we look at this ring, the ring is attack main percentage. So for the substats down here, we do 28 plus, oops, actually it's usually easier if you just start with the crit damage. So that's 14 for the crit damage, plus 7.5 for the crit, plus 28 for the speed, 49 points for the ring here, and then plus however much this attack is, probably a couple points at least. So this is roughly a 50-ish gear score ring for Kisei. And so this illustrates a nice point. This piece here is like 70 plus, and this piece is 50 ish. This is an OK Kisei build. She's not a unit I draft very often, so she's not on premium gear, but you can see the disparity there between like 70 and 50. That's going to be very common for you, and this brings up an important point when I talked about like what your goal should be for a piece of gear. Your goals need to be higher for the left side than for the right side. The reason for that is it's much easier to get the substat combination you're looking for on the left because there's lower possibilities. Because it's easier to get that substat combination, that means you get more pieces with that substat combination, which means you roll more pieces with that substat combination, which means you have a higher likelihood of getting high rolls on those substats for that piece. So you will get more high gear score left-sided pieces than right-sided pieces. Therefore, to build your heroes, you're going to have to tolerate lower, gear score on the right than left, generally speaking. So most people, when they're starting out, want to look for 60 points at level 90 on the left, and then on the right you can usually tolerate 50 when you start, and then that'll gradually move up the more you farm. Having 50 points on a few right-sided pieces is by no means a deal breaker when you're new to the game, or even mid or late game. Boots here, I mentioned earlier that speed is the best bang for your buck. Well, the reason is pretty obvious if you look at gear score. If we multiply this by 2, we get 90. So 90 points for this main stat, right? We don't really add that in our gear score total here, but it does affect, the unit stats overall. If you were to put a different main stat up here and get your speed in the substats, these main stat, like attack percentage up here, it only goes up to 65. So by using a speed main boot, you're getting 90 points versus 65 for just the main stat. Makes a big deal, or a big difference. The same is true of crit chance necks. However, most units have a hard time using crit chance necks because, they'll have crit percentage on many of the items, and they'll have a bunch of crit chance baked into their, baseline stats. And if you add crit chance, which is 60, you get way over 100 pretty easily. So the units that use crit chance necks are typically units with low base crit that are bruisers and want a ton of stats. So Spectre Tenebria is the perfect example. So again, 1.5 times 60 here, you can see you're getting 90 points of gear score here, right? Versus like a crit damage, which is like 70. So 70 star 1.1, 77, right? That's a few rolls worth of stats just by using a crit chance neck if you can fit it in. So that's another potential combination or opportunity of things that you're looking for. Another issue that comes up when you're looking at account progression is deciding how to spend your crafting resources. I get asked this question a lot. Should I craft left-sided gear, right-sided gear? Should I mix it up? How should I distribute my resources? And to answer that question, we have to look at the odds of getting a good piece when we craft these items. So I already mentioned earlier in the video how certain substats are not available on certain pieces. So for example, swords cannot get flat defense or defense percentage, and chess pieces cannot get attack percentage or flat attack. For that reason, the number of substat combinations on swords and chess is smaller than that for something like a helm, which can have all of the substat combinations on it. Therefore, since there's fewer combinations on swords and chess pieces, you have greater odds of getting a favorable combination of substats. So for example, it is higher odds of getting attack percentage, crit chance percentage, crit damage percentage, and speed on a sword than it is for a helm, because a helm could randomly roll in defense, right? Whereas swords cannot. So for that reason, when you're starting the game, it is favorable to craft swords and chess pieces because you have no good pieces of gear in any slot, right? So you want to maximize your chances of getting a good piece. So if you focus on the pieces that have the highest odds of giving you a good substat combination, you'll maximize your odds of getting a good finished piece of gear. As you progress a little bit further, you'll probably switch over to helms because you'll have a few good swords and chests, so you need a helm to go along with that. That'll give you your next biggest bang for the buck in terms of progression. And for a long while, you will not really craft necks, rings, or boots because they have the main stat variability, and it is very difficult to get a good neck, ring, or boot by crafting. Instead, you can use equipment conversion on your right-sided pieces, and that will greatly increase the odds of you getting a good piece of gear. So whenever you get one of those selection chests that allows you to select a gem, you should really be selecting a boot gem, a ring gem, or a neck gem. And which gem you'll get, I think, will probably depend on just what your luck has been. Most people recommend you start off getting speed gems and making boots. The alternatives could be, like a HP percentage gem for a neck, or an attack percentage gem for a ring, or perhaps a crit damage or crit chance percentage gem for a neck. Those are all pretty viable. I always recommend that you look at the gear you've received when you're making these decisions, because a lot of advice is just kind of general for everyone, and it may not be appropriate for your account. The reason why most people suggest to use speed gem boots when you're starting the game is because, or for conversion, is because boots have really one useful main stat, which is speed, and in general, having a non-main stat, or having a non-speed main stat on a boot is not really useful. There are very few units that have boots that do not have speed main stat. And so because of that, you have one good potential main stat and then the rest are garbage, whereas rings and neck pieces have multiple good main stats. So for example, on a neck piece, you would want crit damage on many units, crit chance on many units, HP percentage on many units, and then even rare units can use some of the other ones, like defense percentage, for example. On rings, you want rings with F percentage main, you want rings with attack percentage and HP percentage main, and F res percentage main. So you'll have a higher likelihood of just randomly getting one of those than you would a boot. Because boots, all you're really looking for the most part is speed. Like I said, there's rare units that don't use speed main stat on boots, but by and large, the vast majority do. So whenever you get those conversion selection gems, select speed and go with boots. The caveat to that is, hypothetically speaking, when you're farming, you could get a bunch of speed main stat boots on a good set with good substats, right? And maybe your account, just for whatever reason, has never dropped a good attack percentage ring. So you have to look at the needs of your account and take that into consideration when you're deciding what to craft. For the vast majority of people, that's going to be speed boots, just because you need so many of them and they are rarer to get than the others, right? So for the significant proportion of your early progression, you're going to be crafting left side, initially starting with swords and chest pieces, and helms as well, and ignoring the right side in terms of your crafting. It is okay to rarely craft the right side to get mats to convert if you need additional mats to use your gems. That's fine, but for the most part, your crafting is going to go into the left side. People ask, do you ever craft right side in mind? And the answer is yes. As you progress through the game, you're going to get to a point where you'll notice you kind of stop getting upgrades on the left, or you have so many of them that getting another one isn't that big of a deal. And to determine that, again, you're going to have to critically look at your account and assess. But if you notice, for example, that you have a bunch of like 65 to 70 gear score like DPS swords lying around, and all of your DPS units have way inferior right-sided gear, it might be time to start crafting on the right a little bit and move that up. I generally kind of look for a greater than a 10-point gap between the two to determine that. So for example, we looked at my Kisei earlier. We can use her as an example again. This sword is like 70 plus gear score, but this ring is like 50. So if all of my DPS were like that, they're not, but if they all were, I would look at my account and I'd say, well, I have a bunch of 70 gear score stuff on the left, and I only really have 50 gear score stuff on the right. I should probably start crafting some right-sided gear, because I think the odds of getting like a 60 gear score ring are going to be greater than getting like an 80 gear score left-sided piece, and that's going to give me the greatest amount of progression for my account. So again, kind of critically assess, and we think it's okay to have kind of a 10-point gap between the left and right, but if you exceed that and you start getting into a 20-point gap between the left and the right, I think that's when I generally start to craft on the right side, in addition to using conversion. You'll of course get random conversion gems on the left just by doing world boss and the random gem chests and whatnot, so obviously use those as well. No point in not using those. Okay, so I just pulled up Fribbles so I could show you. This is a really good way to evaluate where you're looking for upgrades. This is a program. You can get it online. There's links all over the place to find Fribbles. It's a free program that was developed by a fan of Epic 7. Lets you load all your gear in and all the builds for your heroes. It's really excellent. And you can see here, for example, my Landy, if you look at her gear score, it's like all these things are like 70 plus, right? So this is a really high gear score Landy. But if you go down on my priority list, you can see that not all heroes have gear at that level, right? Because you're just not going to get that much high quality gear. So like look at Phyllis, for example. She's holding kind of filler gear. This is much lower gear score stuff. And once you are able to kind of put all your heroes in this list, you can go down and you can see where your weaknesses are. And it's good to assess that. Like look at your immunity gear. See, do I have high quality immunity gear pieces on my heroes? So if I go up to Landy, for example, and let's say the immunity pieces, like this one's 78 and this one's 75. So if I wanted to improve Landy, I'm actually better off going into Wyvern because I have other pieces here that are below 78 and 75. And if I want to upgrade these, then I have to get the speed ones, because getting a piece higher than 75 or 78 is almost impossible. Getting a piece better than 71 is extremely difficult, but easier than 78, right? So that's how you would look for upgrades. And you can do the same thing for other sets too. Like if we look at Crowl here, he has a 61 immunity and a 63. And then speed set 58, 65. So I could really go into Azimanic or Wyvern if I wanted to improve Crowl. So look at your units in that way and figure out where the weak points are. Apocalypse Ravi, for example, has generally pretty high gear score stuff. Let's find a unit that could use more upgrades, maybe. Okay, so like here's Celine. Her pen pieces are actually both pretty good. The boot is 67, so that's pretty good for a right-sided piece. The sword is 73, that's good for a left-sided piece. And then she has a bunch of speed set gear that's like, here are 260 pieces, for example. So if I wanted a better Celine, I'm better off going into Wyvern to farm that. And so that's kind of how I address what I should be farming at the moment. Is I don't ask myself what hunt should I farm. I ask myself, what unit am I building or what unit am I upgrading? Then I look at their gear and I see what hunt do I need to go to address their weak points. We can also just take a quick look and you can see the sets that I'm using here on a lot of my units, and you can see how common speed set is, right? But a lot of my really speedy DPS heroes are using crit set, so again, very useful. And then pen set is also pretty popular. A lot of immunities here. And so as you're going through and you're building out your roster, that's a good way of figuring out, what hunt to farm. You can see that if you just did Wyvern and Azimanic, you could build the majority of my roster on that, right? And you would be probably fine. So those are the two I think that you really need to focus on in the beginning. Okay, so one of the last things I want to do is maybe just quickly look through some of the heroes on my roster and look at the main stats for the right side, just so you can get an idea of units that might be using kind of like weird combinations of gear that you might not have thought about. You can see that most DPS heroes are going to be on crit damage, attack, and speed. That's just kind of how DPS heroes are generally built. No surprise there. We looked at Summertime Iceria. So here's a unit that is going to use attack main on the neck. That's not very common. So if you get attack main necks, think about units like Summertime Iceria that are going to want these substats. This is a perfect neck for her. She also uses an attack ring, and she uses speed boots. Let's see here. These are all pretty standard units, so they're not going to have any huge surprises. Bruisers generally want crit damage or crit chance on their necks. Crit chance is hard to make, to make it work, but if you can, like with Spectre, you should, as I mentioned. Tanks like Tywin, you're looking at health, effectiveness. You could also go HP here if you had really high effectiveness subs as well. And this is something that makes Fribbles so good, is it's going to be able to figure out really easily, like what the optimum combinations of things are. We don't have to do that on our own anymore. But just be aware, that you could build him with HP, ring or effectiveness ring, doesn't really matter. Phyllis is a unit that uses defense percentage because she scales off of it in her kit here. There are not too many units that scale off defense percentage, but Phyllis is one of them. So keep an eye out for defense main rings. You theoretically could use a defense main neck for her as well, and then use a health ring down here if you wanted, and that would probably easily get you the balance that you're looking for. But it's kind of hard to pull off defense percentage main rings, even with like nice Soul Weaver substat combinations, just because you generally want them to be a little more health heavy. It's just kind of how it falls out, but depending on your substat combinations, always a possibility. Crit main neck, as I mentioned, are kind of hard. This one rolled super high speed, so I just used it on a Sid. This would be also a very nice Flitica neck, because she wants a lot of crit and a lot of speed, and she doesn't care so much about damage. So that's something to think about. Crow's on health and speed. Carrot is another one that can use health or attack, just like Samurai Iceria on the main stats here. So think about that with Carrot. Ruel, typical Soul Weaver is going to be HP and ER, and speed down here for the boots. They're all probably like that. Let's see here. Basar. Oh, here's Inferno Kawazu. He's kind of using some wonky stuff. He's using an attack main because his damage scales off that, and I just went for like really fast pieces to try and have him cut. Not super impressed with him as a hero though. See some bruisers. Here's Violet. Violet's a hero you could build with without speed on his main stat down here, just because he doesn't need to be super fast. He's a hero that's a little bit unique in that regard. So every so often you can get away with a piece like this without speed in the main. Now, hypothetically speaking, it would be better for him to have speed here and then have no speed subs on any of the gear. That would be more efficient and you'd have higher stats overall if you did that. But I just don't have that many pieces of Lifesteal Gear with no speed on it. So it's fine. You're kind of looking for like 160 speed on him. So you can get that, with just random speed subs. But that's, a potential combo and an opportunity to use a non-speed main boot, which is always nice when you can use those because they are pretty hard to make work. Here's kind of a unique hero. So a nice opportunity to use your crit set gear. It can be hard to use that in later RTA just because so many units want like pen set or immunity. It's hard to fit crit in. And so doing this like a triple combo of 3 2-piece sets allows you to do that and get really nice stats. So we can see that here. This gives us immunity, gives us pen set, and crit set. This could be an opportunity to use Golem Gear, theoretically, if you have it, right? You could use an HP or defense set here. But as we've seen, we generally don't need Golem Gear for other things, so here's another hero that can use attack main, or hypothetically HP main or whatever, right? I think it's nice for her to have attack on both just because it makes it easier to get that really high attack number. But if you had super high attack subs on your gear, you could probably do an HP main on one of these as well. But any hero that's built really slow, that's when you can get away with, without the speed main. So let's see here. Charlotte is just lifesteal. So here's Rem. Rem is like a base speed unit, so another unit that you can get away without speed set. She's on counter and she's bruiser, so just really any variety of percentages is what you're looking for on her. I think hypothetically you could build her on a crit neck, but I think that would be extremely difficult. Her imprint release is crit chance, so that with her base crit is going to make using a crit neck virtually impossible, and you kind of want high crit damage anyway, so crit damage neck is probably the only way for her. Seaside Bellona I just haven't been using, but she's another hero that could use random like percentage mains on the boot and on the neck, so you're just looking for really high percentage gears overall, and she doesn't need a ton of crit damage. This is a super old build, it's kind of outdated. I probably should just switch her to Lifesteal or something, but I was using it for anti-cleave back in old seasons. Rawana is another turtle. She's very slow, so you can get away with health. Ken, so I don't have a ring for him, Ken is an example of using golem gear, right? Because Ken doesn't want crit, so here's kind of a weird gear combination. He's also a hero that wants some amount of effect resistance, so you're looking for pretty much all the percentages except for effectiveness and except for crit. So you can get away with some weird gear on Ken. I'm just looking for a ring that would work well with him, to bump him up, but he's kind of not super usable right now anyways. I think, that's most of it. Dillabet is another defense person, so she's somebody that can use a defense percentage main ring. You probably want a crit damage neck on her. I took it off and gave it to someone else just because I never draft Dillabet, it seems like. So something to think about. I think overall, though, I addressed pretty much everything. I know I went over a little bit quickly how to calculate gear score. I've talked about that in older videos, so I didn't want to focus on it as much. I'll put the formula for that in the description below. Let me know if you have any questions on how to calculate gear score. Hopefully the couple examples I showed, were adequate. What I really wanted to address in this video was the progression of hunts, like how you should be looking at going through those, when you should switch over from one hunt to another. I think we addressed that. And then, how you should move your goalpost as you progress through the game, right? When you first start farming, you're looking for 60 points post reforge, and then that number is going to go up the more you farm. You can be tolerant of lower gear score on the right-sided gear, typically about 10 points below your left-sided gear, and that's until you're uber late game, and all you're looking for is like 70 plus right-sided gear pieces. So hopefully you get there one day. Please let me know in the comment section below if you have any questions. Otherwise, that'll be it for now. Later.